brought him to the front of the yard, and I just went out, and he was so cold. And I just remember saying over and over, I'm so sorry, I didn't see how much in pain you were.
Suicide leaves living victims.
At times I was so angry with God that I would have thrown God to the farthest depths of the ocean. And yet on the other hand, I was so desperate for a closer relationship, because God had always been my strength and my faith.
More Canadians kill themselves than die in car accidents. Every 2 hours, someone in Canada dies by suicide. Every hour, at least 2 people try. They leave behind parents, children, loved ones who are haunted by the death, who ask themselves, why didn't I see it? What if I had? And for people of faith, why, God? Where were you? Judy Hopkin is a lay minister with the Community of Christ Church in Hamilton, Ontario. Her husband Willis was also a minister. They met across a volleyball court.
I don't know how he felt at the time, but I thought, I need to meet that guy. And I went home that weekend and told my father, I just met the fellow that I want to marry.
Really?
And 3 dates later, we were engaged. Now, it was over a period of 3 months, but and then 6 months later, we were married.
They would be married 35 years. Judy taught nursing until the first baby came. Together, they raised 3 children, Sarah, Rachel, and Adam. Willis was a high school science teacher.
Is that a ukulele?
It is a ukulele.
So this was part of his teaching method?
Humor was a huge part of his teaching, and he had jokes every day, and the kids would ask him, for jokes. And I mean, a lot of them were sick and stupid jokes, but he had a lot of fun with it. This one, with the skeleton's arm around his shoulder and his Mexican hat on.
Willis was not a typical minister. He liked to grow his beard wild, ride a motorcycle to church events. He was active and outgoing, but every autumn, he changed.
When the sunlight decreased, when starting sort of into the fall season, I used to call it he got a little hibernate-y. He would sleep more in the evenings. He didn't have as much energy, wasn't as interested in doing things socially.
10 years ago, Willis was diagnosed with seasonal affective disorder, or SAD. That's depression caused by a lack of sunlight. He took Prozac and light therapy during the winter months. It seemed to work. 2 years ago, Judy and Willis went on an Alaskan cruise. They'd forgotten Willis' medication. Willis told Judy not to worry about it.
And so we did. We went on our cruise and we had a wonderful time, and it was, a dream for us, and we loved it. And I could tell that he should have started his medication. It's just that slowing type of behaviors. But we figured, as soon as we get home, it will be fine.
But it wasn't fine. Willis still taught at school every day. But he had no energy in the evening. He was depressed.
We were increasing the dosage, But if you know medications, it takes like a 4 to 6 week period of time for medication to get to its optimum level of functioning. And that's what we were doing. This was just a waiting game. But I also asked him every day, you know, how depressed are you? Are you safe? And he always replied affirmatively. He was okay.
But he wasn't okay. One Sunday 2 years ago, Judy went to church. Willis wasn't feeling well. He stayed home.
When I got home from church, he just left a note and said I went out for a drive. And I presumed he'd gone to visit with our friend, and I thought, great. He's feeling better. He's making a social move. This is terrific. And I lay down and had an afternoon nap. And when I woke up and I realized he wasn't back, I thought, you know, boy, he really must be feeling better to have stayed a couple of hours.
Hours went by. Judy was worried. She asked a friend to help her look for him.
I went downstairs and checked the gun safe because he hunts. And things were fine, and by now it was getting dark out, and Dave said, well, I'll go out and check the back shed. Dave came back into the house, and I could just tell by the look on his face. And I said to him, did you find him? And he said, yes. And I said to him, is he alive? And he said, no.
Willis had hanged himself.
I can remember sitting with my hand over my mouth the whole time, and it's like I was trying to stuff it in. I mean, for me, I told them that I needed to see him before they took his body off the property. I guess that was just intuitively something that I needed to do to make sure that this really had happened. They brought him to the front of the yard, and I just went out, and you know, he was so cold. And I just remember saying over and over, I'm so sorry, I didn't see how much in pain you were. And I just said to him, go with God, you know.
The family tore down the shed with sledgehammers. They didn't want to be reminded. They planted a tree in its place, but it did not bring peace to Judy.
I'd yell at God in the car sometimes. Why? You know, I don't understand. You know, why couldn't, I was in church. Why couldn't you have alerted me that my husband was at home and in crisis? I don't understand that at a time and a place where I was trying to be so in tune with God. How could I not hear a voice saying, go home, your husband needs you?
After the break, Judy struggles to go on.
I didn't make any meals. I didn't grocery shop. You can't do any of those kinds of things. And that's normal.
After Willis died, Judy needed help. She turned to her church.
The first time I went back to church actually was the first Sunday of Advent, and I had often worked as a pianist at the church. But I had to focus so intensely on the music and on not being emotional that by the time I went home that night, I had such a back pain that I was hardly able to move for the next day or two. And I realized I was just keeping my tension in so severely, this was not a helpful thing for me at all.
Judy took a break from her ministry. Friends and family comforted her, but she needed more.
With the grief, did you also become depressed?
Depressed is an interesting term. If you mean, did I become clinically depressed, like as a diagnosis? No. Was I depressed? Absolutely.
She went to counseling and a support group for families coping with suicide. Once a month, they meet at a Baptist church in Burlington, Ontario. Meetings are normally confidential. Tonight is an exception. A few members offered to share their stories with 360 Vision.
The changing of relationships.
Walter Mulkowicz founded the group 5 years after his wife died. Back then, Mulkowicz was coping with his own leukemia. Bev was being treated for Parkinson's disease and depression. She left the hospital undetected and drowned herself.
At a certain point, yes, I decided that I'd like to lead a support group. And I think why it's important is because you do have to talk about it. And it is important to be able to talk about it in a safe environment where you know someone's not going to judge you or say, well, that's silly.
I went through a lot of guilt as well, but
Lori Miller joined the group 2 years ago after her son Ben killed himself. He was addicted to OxyContin, a painkiller. The withdrawal was unbearable.
down. I felt desperate. It was almost like breath. I needed, and people would say, no, you're not ready. You're not ready to go. You're not ready to, and there's one place they called, they didn't even want to see you in the first year, which is a total crime. And I mean, I understand their theory of thought, but to me it was, I got to be around other people that have gone through that. I got to be around them because...
Margaret Mercer still wonders about her husband's death. She thinks Todd had undiagnosed schizophrenia. 3 years he jumped off a bridge.
I feel he made a mistake. He made a mistake. That comes to me almost every day. What a mistake. You know, you could have talked to somebody, you could have taken medication. I really needed to talk to somebody, and that I couldn't burden friends with that, and I certainly couldn't be so needy and demanding of people. And you get to the point where you talk to people and then you feel that they might say, and people start to say, you need to move on now. And that is so out of touch with the situation.
I found that the grief process...
The group says grieving a suicide is different from other deaths.
I was so mad. I just, because I had prayed so hard for my son that all would work out and everything was going to be okay. And it wasn't. It didn't. You know, and then I had somebody say to me once, well, you know, my husband had, it was either an issue with his eye or his brain or something like that. Well, you know, we prayed so hard and had so many people praying for him, and he, you know, our prayers worked. You know, and it made me feel like I got angry with her. And I said, yeah, well, I prayed too. And my prayers didn't work.
After the break, fighting the stigma.
people like myself who are survivors of suicide, if we don't step to the plate and talk about it and try to change the system in terms of the healthcare system, if we don't try to end the stigma, who else is going to do it?
Some faith groups used to call suicide a sin. The dead were refused rites and burial on sacred grounds. Many faith groups see it differently now. Harming yourself is not a sane choice, so it can't be a sin. But suicide and mental illness are still stigmatized. People don't talk about them, and that doesn't help. At St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, Dr. Paul Link studies the causes of suicide. He says the worst thing you can do is ignore depression.
There's a fear sometimes that people have if they talk to someone who's depressed and say, are you thinking about suicide? Do you have a plan right now? They might be afraid that that will actually instigate the person to do something.
Right.
Is that a right or a wrong thing to do?
Well, it's just the opposite, actually. Usually when a person is that distressed, they want to, share their burden. So it's actually the talking about it that can be life-saving. So we do encourage on the one-to-one basis that if a person's concerned about it, open up the topic, make that connection with the person, and that often can be life-saving.
If I had asked him and probed, now that we've been through this information on suicide, that you can say to a person, do you have and to probe a little bit more, but I didn't probe. I didn't. And with the benefit of hindsight, there were so many things I would have done differently.
The people in Malkowicz's group have something else in common besides grief. They're advocates. Miller lobbies for better treatment for drug addiction. Mercer and Malkowicz are members of the Halton Suicide Prevention Coalition.
And I think the conclusion I've come to is if people like myself who are survivors of suicide, if we don't step to the plate and talk about it and try to change the system in terms of the healthcare system, if we don't try to end the stigma, who else is going to do it?
Help can also come from faith.
There is a relationship, we believe, between sort of religious faith and suicide, but it's probably a very complex one. For example, some of the countries that prohibit overt activity related to church do have some of the highest rates. And some countries that are very, strongly in terms of their action of religious faith, like Roman Catholic countries, have somewhat lower rates. So it is related to those kinds of things. But on a personal level, it's probably related to one's participation and belief. So people who are very active in the church perhaps are more protected from suicide.
But sometimes faith isn't enough, even for a minister like Willis. Faith couldn't cure his depression.
I know that the way my husband was feeling with depression, it's like a blind is pulled over all that is light, and that he could not sense peace and hope and light and faith and God. It's like he couldn't get there. Not that God wasn't there, it's just that he couldn't sense that presence.
Judy is still not working as a minister. She's not ready to go back. But when she does, She wants to be better at helping others cope with grief. So she's taking bereavement courses. For now, she's still in counseling and getting by with a lot of help from her family.
My two nieces for Christmas gave me a mug, and it says, you always hear the line, when God closes one door, he opens another, etc. And when I got this mug, it cracked me right up because it adds the line, but it's hell in the hallways. And so for me, it was just an affirmation that it's been an awful journey trying to get from one door to another, but I do believe